covering Canada from coast to coast to coast. National Post Radio on Canada Talks, SiriusXM 167.
Good morning. Thanks for being here with me. Matt Gurney here. National Post Radio continues. Rebecca Fortin, my next guest, joining me now. She's a global journalism fellow at the Munk School of Global Affairs at the University of Toronto and the chair of Health Promotion Canada. Rebecca, good morning. Thanks for being here.
Good morning, Matt. Thank you for having me.
My pleasure, truly. We've talked a couple of times, Rebecca, on the show, just to set the table for you a bit, about the idea of a guaranteed minimum income, a basic minimum income. Pick your term. We're all talking about generally the same thing here. And I think there's a fair degree of literacy among my listeners, and I think Canadians in general, about what it means, at least in broad strokes, replacing complicated, administered, overseen social welfare programs with direct cash support from the government. It's an interesting idea. We have tried them in the small scale before, including here in Canada and in some jurisdictions overseas as well. And I was mentioning earlier, Rebecca, it's an idea that holds appeal on the left and the right, because you can sell it to the left as an enhanced way of providing social benefits to vulnerable people. You can sell it to the right as a way of, as compassionate conservatism, I guess. But you can also make it a case on simple raw arithmetic grounds. It's a way of hopefully shrinking government and making it more efficient. There's a lot to like in the idea, but a lot of the trials we've had in them in Canada are old. Ontario is now considering another trial program. What's your take on that?
I think it's very exciting for Ontario to be looking at this policy again, and considering our current context, I think it's a very exciting program for Ontario, given that we have a very good platform. Like you said, there's a lot of really great support for this from both the right and from the left. And there's been a number of groups who've been thinking about this in the current context, and they think it's the right time to consider a pilot in Ontario.
What would a pilot look at, Rebecca? Because my concern is going to be, having observed Canadian governments at work before, is that we will pilot project this thing to death for the next 200 years and never actually roll it out here. What would a pilot project have to accomplish so that it would be meaningful enough to perhaps set the stage for an actual rollout of a program or a slate of programs like this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think a pilot in Ontario, a number of the experts that I've been speaking with over the last little bit are calling for a pilot that will fill some of the gaps that we have. So, in fact, we have 33 basic income type programs across Canada already in place and working for Canadians, particularly for children with parents who are living in low-income situations, as well as seniors who are also living in low-income situations. So the experts that I've been speaking to call for a pilot that will help the middle age adults who are working or not, or who are struggling to make ends meet. And something like a basic income program in Ontario might be an answer to some of that.
What I think is interesting, taking the big picture look at this as well, is that, it would be a really useful way to try it, but I think there would be resistance to this because I think Canadian governments, and I don't mean this in a partisan way, Rebecca, but I think Canadian jurisdictions are actually quite conservative, particularly in fiscal matters. And again, I don't mean blue Tory conservative. I just mean change averse. It's one thing to commit to a trial project, but if it's 150 people on a 2-year period, I'm not convinced it's going to be meaningful. The only way to really figure out if a guaranteed minimum income or a basic income will actually work in terms of being like the centerpiece of a social policy agenda is going to be to try it on a jurisdiction of enough scale that it matters and for long enough to get some good data out of it. I am concerned that however the idea may look on paper, I don't know who the first jurisdiction would be to bite and actually jump in on that and say, we're going to make the commitment to trying this out.
I fully agree, Matt, and we all are waiting anxiously for the Honourable Hugh Siegel's report on what his recommendations are specifically for an Ontario pilot. So right now it's only speculation in terms of what the program might look like, who it might be able to participate in the pilot. So it'll be interesting to see how deep that pilot will go, what populations are going to be invited to participate, what jurisdictions even within Ontario, whether it's in Toronto or we're going to cover some northern communities in Ontario looking at our Indigenous populations. So it'll be interesting to see what comes out of the recommendations and what actually can get into place by the end of this fiscal year. But it is exciting to have the conversation going. It is bringing together lots of different groups on this issue, from the business sector to the faith sector to the health sector. There's a lot more attention being made to this, and so it'll be interesting to see what comes out of Mr. Siegel's recommendations coming out fairly soon.
I'm speaking with Rebecca Fortin. She is a Global Journalism Fellow at the Munk School of Global Affairs and at the University of Toronto, and also the Chair of Health Promotion Canada. Rebecca, would this be something, and I would hope so, because I'm an evidence-based kind of guy. That's how I like to make my decisions when possible. Would it be possible to take a certain number of Ontarians who are receiving social benefits through an existing system and say, okay, we're taking you out of this system and we're providing a different kind of supplement instead? Hopefully do it at enough of a scale that it's meaningful. Would it be possible to do kind of an A/B test on this sort of thing? I mean, that's how I would want to do it, but I guess the question that would come up is, if it's a disaster, is it moral to do that? Is it moral to take someone who is vulnerable and already on social supports, presumably for a good reason, hopefully for a good reason, and to subject them to experimentation? Look, if it works, fantastic. They're heroes. They've led the way to a social revolution in Canada. If it falls flat on its face, it's kind of awkward if you're one of the guys who got selected to go out and be on the losing group.
I fully agree, and my background is in public health and looking at populations as a whole and coming up with interventions. I think you have to be even more strategic and thoughtful in your approach to conducting these types of pilots, because you're right, it does impact a lot of people at a time. I think I can answer that in two ways. One is we already know that it works. From past examples, so Evelyn Forget, the health economist from Manitoba, she was able to show through a pilot test that occurred in Dauphin, Manitoba. They set up the pilot with controls in other parts of Manitoba with participants in Winnipeg, and they showed over time that this does work. And even though that those studies were done in the 1970s, the evidence that she shows that it still could be very much relevant to a population now in Ontario today. Secondly, is we know from modern statistics that some of the basic like income programs that already exist in Canada, like the guaranteed income supplement for seniors, is working as well. So researchers, Dr. Lynn McIntyre from the University of Calgary, who's been studying hunger and poverty for over 20 years, has looked at it using the Canadian Community Health Survey data, and she's found that just by having a birthday at age 65, low-income seniors, their food insecurity decreases by almost half. So we know that it already works. And then secondly, we can look to these types of researchers like Dr. Lynn McIntyre and Dr. Evelyn Forget to help us design a project that will be robust, that can be adjusted. Say we do go down a road that isn't helpful for these individuals, that we can adjust and use the data in real time to make a difference.
This is going to seem weird, Rebecca. I acknowledge that, but you'll see where I'm going with it. Do you remember a couple of years ago? If you're at the University of Toronto, I'm going to assume you either live in or around Toronto. A couple of years ago, we had that ice storm of 2014 around Christmas. I remember they were handing out, the Ontario government, as part of its emergency responses, especially for those who lost power for days or even over a week, was gift cards to major grocery stores. And the grocery stores got into it in a philanthropic way to make some donations. And I remember thinking at the time, and it kind of speaks to the idea of just the efficiency of it, food banks are great, but wouldn't it be better if we could just give the needy cards that let them buy food? And I know it's overly simplistic because we have food deserts in areas that don't have access to good, nutritious food, but it just struck me as an example, and we see it occasionally in the aftermath of major disasters. We've seen it, the FEMA in the United States after hurricanes. We saw it in Ontario after the ice storm. One of the first things the governments do, because they understand the problems, especially for those who've lost everything or have lost access to their banking, is cold, hard cash, and people will usually spend it well. Maybe you limit it to only being spent on essential goods, clothing and food and stuff, or maybe it literally is just as FEMA did in the U.S., debit cards preloaded with thousands of dollars for those who are dispossessed. We do have evidence that people will make good decisions in this kind of a case. Do we have evidence, Rebecca, that it actually lowers the administration costs of government? Because half the argument is the good it can do to people. The other half is the good it can do to our bottom line, just by cutting out the middleman, the food bank or the welfare agency, and just saying, here's your card, you go get what you need.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I fully agree, Matt. And I wouldn't have any particular studies or reports at my fingertips to point to, but anecdotally, for sure, there certainly is opportunities for efficiencies, and that comes with some challenges. How do you support a system, a formal system that has all of these complicated pathways already in place, and how do we shift our system to be more dignified and more supportive of people who certainly just need cold hard cash. And like you said, people, when they are given resources, they use it appropriately. That they want to feed their children and send their kids to school with proper school supplies, like any parent would want for their children. So certainly there is some concern about how this can roll out from an administration perspective, and I think that will something that the Ontario pilot will have to look at and study closely as well, not just the impacts of the program to the participants, but also the impacts to the system itself.
Rebecca, we really appreciate your time this morning. I'm very interested in seeing if this works. I think it could actually be transformational if we do it right. So fingers crossed. Appreciate your time, your expertise on this one. Let's see what happens.
Thank you very much, Matt.
My pleasure, truly. Rebecca Fortin joining me, Global Journalism Fellow at the Munk School of Global Affairs at the University of Toronto and a chair of Health Promotion Canada. We'll be back in just a couple of minutes. National Post Radio, Hour 3 continues right after this.